Okay, so hopefully some people are just a little late, kind of filtering in, but that's okay because as I said, this event will be recorded. So good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to a very special event with the New Zionist Congress, a conversation with Professor Ruth Wisse on her latest book, Free as a Jew, a Personal Memoir of National Self-Liberation. I have a copy right here. I have several copies right here, actually. Professor Wisse, how are you? Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you for organizing this. Thanks.
Of course, very happy to have you. So although Professor Wisse needs no introduction, we're going to give one, of course. So Ruth Wisse is a world-renowned academic with significant contributions to Jewish intellectual life. She is currently the Martin Peretz Professor of Yiddish Literature and taught comparative and Yiddish literature at Harvard. But before this, she taught Yiddish literature and helped found the Department of Jewish Studies at McGill University in Montreal. She has been a decades-long contributor to Commentary magazine and a Zionist activist who defends Israel with a conviction all of us are continually inspired by. She currently does work with the Tikva Fund, hosting lectures and conversations about Jewish politics and Jewish history and Jewish theology. And her books, all of which I've read, all of which I cannot recommend enough, include If I Am Not for Myself, The Liberal Betrayal of the Jews, The Modern Jewish Canon, and Jews and Power. So the way that this discussion will work is we will spend the first portion chatting with Professor Wisse about the themes and arguments in her book, and then I will ask the audience questions that have been submitted to me beforehand via email. Some of them have been submitted by people who could not be here today. That's all right. If you would like to submit questions during the talk, there is still time. You can send them over to newzionists@gmail.com. That's newzionists, all lowercase, one word, @gmail.com. And of course, if you enjoyed tonight's event, please make sure to sign up to be the first to be alerted to new events with NZC at newzionists.org. That's newzionists.org. And please follow us on social media at New Zionist Congress on Instagram and at New Zionists on Twitter. All right, shall we get started? Is that all right with you?
With me, for sure.
Okay, great. All right, so again, thank you for being here. And Professor Wisse, one of the reasons why I and so many of us enjoyed your book so much was because it offered us a window into a Jewish world that is so rich in culture and in intellectual spirit and pride. It was truly marvelous. Your childhood was truly marvelous. You had Jewish poets and playwrights and politicians in and out of your family home throughout your education and your career, and of course, writing at Commentary magazine. And I know this has shaped who you are today. My question is, does this sort of Jewishness exist in North America anymore? Specifically a type of Jewishness that is not, it doesn't need to be very observantly Jewish. You know, we're not speaking about very religious communities, which obviously have a lot of culture and spirit within them, but one that is profoundly Jewish in its culture and identity, the way that you experienced it.
Well, I think you're asking a very important question, and everything that we've discussed in the past has really been very serious to consider. We don't choose where we're born or into what situation we're born, but you're quite right that a lot has changed. And one of the things that you point to is, unfortunately, I would say, not possible any longer. You see, my parents' generation was the first generation to come out of really very traditional homes. Almost all of them were Jewishly practicing homes, both my mother and my father, who left home very early in their lives. My mother, because she was orphaned by the time she was 18. My father, because he left home to study. So they didn't really stay at home, but they had been raised in a traditional home. And all around them in Vilna were people like themselves who were really now out of their parents' homes. They were a youth culture, really, very much a youth culture, song that you can identify with, the youth culture of Vilna in those years. But what we can't see is what it is like to be the first generation out of that, and to be living in a what seemed to be then a very promising time. And then when my parents had to flee Europe and come to North America, in our case to Montreal, Canada, they came into another place where people were exactly like them in that way. Everybody was still Yiddish speaking among my parents' friends. Everybody had been raised more or less traditionally. So what they had was everything that was already in them. And that was something that we absorbed without even knowing. I mean, we just took it for granted that that was what Jewishness was. And in the book, I try to describe what a strange combination it was. Everybody decided for themselves where to place the emphasis. So in our case, for example, if I described to you what our home was like, you would say, this is tremendously inconsistent, as indeed it was. So, for example, my mother never liked it in later years when I reminded people that, you know, we had ham in the house. Well, my mother in her youth days had also eaten ham, but pork, never. Bacon, unthinkable. So how do you account for that? Where, you know, if you know, that's one thing. The other thing is, I won't go on too long about this, but for instance, Passover, my parents came to Canada in 1940, just in the war. The war was everywhere, sort of in us, even though it was not around us in Canada. I mean, we were living with it through the newspapers and through letters that my parents were getting and accounts that they were hearing. Every day we were living with half our minds overseas. But somehow when it came to Passover, even the first year, my mother changed all the dishes. Now, we didn't have two sets of dishes at home. We didn't have milchik and fleishik dishes. We didn't keep milk and meat separate or anything of that kind. But for Passover, she completely koshered the house. My father went around scooping up, you know, the chametz. And how come? And the 2 nights of the Sidorim were absolutely sacred. We went through every word of the text with guests around the table. Those were the most memorable times of my childhood, so that the Haggadah was engraved in us so deeply that even though we did not go to shul on Shabbos, we did not read through the Chumash in any way, but Pesach was so very important that experience of we were slaves in the land of Egypt and we came to freedom, you know, that was real. We didn't have to say, you know, this is happening to you in every generation. Pretend that it's happening to you in generation. There was no pretense about it.
You know, right.
So we were the door, and it was Bechol Dor Vador. So things were very deep. To get to the second part of your question, is that replicable? Well, I would say you have to understand that it cannot be, because culture is not biologically transmitted. I came to that formulation gradually over years, but it's one that I come to all the time. Democracy is not biologically transmitted. Judaism is really not biologically transmitted. I mean, it is, of course, but all the content of it is something that you must laboriously, you know, transmit. And so what happened was that in families like ours, where indeed we were sent to Jewish day schools, where the house was Yiddish speaking, where we were surrounded with books that were in Yiddish, and with a culture so absorbing that for the first, you know, 20 years when I did live at home, you know, this was part of our lives. You know, if it weren't there, what would I have had? You see, and then when it came to raising children, it's funny that we were 4 in the family. My older brother died very young, but still, I would say this for all of us. My siblings, we all are much more observant in the traditional sense than our parents were. And why is that? Because I think that, and we never discussed this among ourselves, but I think each of us understood that if we did not put more into our Jewishness, we did not have any longer what our parents had had. So our children, although I started speaking Yiddish to our oldest, but it didn't work very well. Since our input was never going to be what it was in my parents' generation. We were not living in that kind of a really intensely Jewish community. We had to do more to invest that Judaism. We had to make sure to send our children to Jewish day schools, of course, but we had to also be more observant, how to put it. So we all keep a kosher home. We are much more invested in synagogue life than our parents were. And depending on the grandchildren, some of them are really, fully observant. Some of them are partly observant, but lighting Shabbos candles, keeping Shabbos, and so forth. I mean, it's the religious part of our lives were intensified deliberately because we were worried about the cultural weakening, you see. And I think that's something that one has to understand. You can choose. Judaism is so rich that you can choose what parts of it you want to really make your own. But you have to understand that if something has been taken away, you have to build the other parts more strongly.
Definitely agree with that. And it's just interesting. So I think you and I definitely agree on a weakening of the culture if it's not inextricably linked to observancy. If you're not growing up in a very observant household, there has been a delineation over the past few decades, but something that I experienced growing up and that many young people in my generation experienced growing up, especially on the reform side, the less religious side, was a replacing of Jewish culture and Jewishness with things like social justice, with things like progressivism, not necessarily from my perspective saying that those are things that we should stay away from, but they were in the place of Judaism. They were being sold to us as an alternative for you to express your Jewish identity. And I think what we've seen is just the hollowness of that, because what it does is, and we'll get to this, of course, later, is it turns people against Israel because they don't have a Jewish peoplehood in that sense of community to fall back on to defend. And they also, Judaism has sort of been warped, and it can only lead to the further removal of actual Jewish things from the American Jewish politic.
Yes, well, you're perfectly right. You see, at the turn of the century, turn of the 19th century, when people wanted to go in that direction, they converted. Mm-hmm. They converted to Christianity. Many people, thousands and thousands of Jews converted to Christianity. And in the United States too, at first, you felt that if you were leaving Judaism, you converted, and you did it for many reasons. One of the books I wrote was about humor. And it's amazing how many jokes had to do with that conversion. The jokes all suggesting that no one would have done it because of serious belief in Christianity. That's the way the joking sort of pointed. But why did you do it? Well, you did it because you wanted to marry a girl who was Christian, or because you wanted a position that you couldn't get as a Jew and that you could only get if you converted, and so forth. Any kind of ambition that you had was associated with conversion. And Heinrich Heine, actually at the beginning of the 19th century, said something. He formulated this, as he always did, brilliantly. He said that conversion was the ticket to European civilization, to European culture, actually. The ticket, you see, to European culture. People paid that ticket. And many had no qualms about it whatsoever. Now, America is very deceptive that way. And on the one hand, it's a wonderful country because it does not demand conversion. You know, you don't have to pretend not to be a Jew to get most jobs. And by this time, there are no country clubs or, you know, all those old ways of being excluded in the ways that one remembered. They really don't exist. There aren't neighborhoods where they won't sell to a Jew, et cetera, et cetera. But that idea of wanting to be part of a larger whole, let's say when you go to the university or anything, that part of just letting the Jewish part go, because you don't have to convert, you don't feel yourself doing that. You don't feel yourself converting. And so what you were describing before is actually a conversion, but it's without baptism. You move into another realm. And as you say, it can be very benign, you understand me. There can be nothing wrong with it. May I just say that I have nothing against people leaving Judaism if they don't want to be Jews. In this, I'm very different from Chabad. There are people that bless them. I really bless them and admire them. They will fight for every last Jew because they feel that's so important. That's not it's never been the way I thought. If people don't like being Jews, they don't want to because there's a lot of pressure, you know, of all kinds. I say goodbye and good luck. But the replacement you're talking about, that's the danger. The danger comes not by leaving Judaism. And by the way, I would much prefer people to go and become Catholics or become serious Christians, you know, than simply drift off into nothing land, because that nothing land so often becomes another ideology in place of Judaism. And many people then say, hey, that's Judaism. So in my mind, what they seem to be doing is to reinventing a secular Christianity. They are inventing a secular religion for themselves. Now that religion, they want to feel that they're good. They want to feel part of something. They want to feel that they're doing something, tikkun olam. They want to, so they create something in place of Judaism that they call Judaism. And that's where you begin to see the danger of things. Now, Christianity in its time was developed by people just like that. They did not like halacha. They did not feel that, you know, that they did not like the halachic kind of Judaism. They didn't feel that it worked for them. So they created a substitute religion, a different religion, which is, you know, has developed in its own ways. And Christianity has its own strengths and it's certainly its own values and its own moral context and so forth. But it's not Judaism, and neither is liberalism Judaism. And what is certainly not Judaism is the Democratic Party. And what is certainly not Judaism is socialism. And what is certainly not Judaism is tikkun olam, because that's not what Judaism ever meant, to correct the world. You must be kidding. What Jews try to do is to become God's people on earth by example, to create a civilization that is so strong that in a sense, at least we civilize ourselves. That's what it means to be, you know, a Jew, to take that on yourself. And in that way, you improve the world. Right? Mm-hmm. Certainly when you are a Jew of that kind, you see how much you do for others. You first learn philanthropy in your own community. You learn decency in your own community. You learn Sabbath and how to protect the environment through your own laws. You see, you do it from the inside out, but you never do it on the outside, you know, in that sense, first and foremost. we are not there to prove anything of that kind. It's a very deformed kind of Judaism that then develops if people think that, they're going to just do good in the world.
Right. So a lot of young people arrive on campus and they either know and agree with everything you said, or they don't know. And they could come from a liberal background, from a conservative background, from a secular background, from a religious background, but they are alarmed and uneasy to encounter on campus a brigade of very, very vocal Jews, very demanding Jews who insert themselves into a lot of different organization meetings and events and programming on campus. And essentially, they have formed the vanguard of anti-Israel activism on campus. They are at the forefront of pushing BDS, of pushing the Deadly Exchange Resolution, which, for those of you who don't know, tethered the IDF to police officers misbehaving in the United States. And they are always propped up and used by anti-Israel organizations to sort of brush away and persuade people against the accusations of anti-Semitism coming from the Jewish students being legitimate. Now, over the last 2 or 3 years, there has been an endless list of things that young Jews can be doing to successfully combat this, to make our rhetoric and our reasoning resonate with the student body. But especially the people who I speak to, a lot of the times it seems hopeless because they seem to be growing in number, because the words that they use are so much more appealing to the student body, and the student body is so much more attuned to that type of political jargon that we just feel like we're losing. So what would your prescription be for us? And that's the reason why we formed NZC, was to bring our heads together and think of ways to confront this very historical, it's not new, but still a very pressing problem.
Well, you say it's not new, but I have to say it is new. I mean, that you are in a pioneering position here, because, I never experienced what you're describing. You see, when we went to school, when I grew up and I spent my adolescence, this is what I call the period of grace in Jewish history. Between 1948, when the State of Israel was created, or when the war was over, let's say, and 1975, when the Zionist racist resolution was passed at the United Nations, Israel was a very strong liberal cause. You never saw anything of the kind that you are describing. And the first time I remember anything negative was when 2 of my fellow professors, we were all very young then, decided that they would go to the Islamic Institute at McGill and they would take an Arabic course. And so they went together, and then they quit after the first week because they said that the teacher there, who was another young guy, a young Arab, had represented the letter hey, ha, through Hitler. So he used it for Hitler, so they were out of there. Well, we thought this was kind of a joke. We didn't report him. I must say that at the time, it struck home, but we never took it seriously. So it was so remote to us, what you're describing. But how quickly this has developed is frightening. So there are many aspects to this that you have to think of. First, I would say this. The most important thing to me, you ask me what to do. Well, I'm not very expert as expert as you are actually at getting in there and doing it, because you are the ones who faced it and did it, and you did something. My contribution, if you will, is to understand what happens, why it happens, how it happens. And I always make the point, to understand is not to be able to repair. I can understand and explain it and everything.
It's like say the scientists research the cure for AIDS, or they research AIDS before they found a cure for AIDS. That's what you're trying to do with anti-Semitism.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly. You have to research it first, and you have to really understand it. So that's number one. The other thing is that the more you have in you, the more knowledge you have of who you are, obviously, the easier it is to deal with. So the one, I would say, fundamental thing is moral confidence. Do you as a Jew have moral confidence, or do you lack it? If you have moral confidence, you can withstand all that garbage that is thrown at you. If you don't have the moral confidence, you cave in every area. I mean, the first time somebody says to you, but what about the Palestinians? What are you doing to the Palestinians? You may even have the knowledge because you went to Jewish day school, or you went to Jewish, and you may have the knowledge. But at that very moment, somebody says to you, if you don't have that moral confidence, then you really don't stand a chance. So that is a second aspect of it. But the main thing here, and this I would try to persuade you of, that if you fight for the truth in our realm, if you fight that horrible BDS movement, if you fight those horrible people whom you are describing, you are not fighting for the Jews. You're fighting for America, because that is deeply anti-Western, anti-American, anti-civilization, anti-truth. It is for repression. It is for murder. It is for genocide. It is for all the bad things in life. You see, to be a Jew has always been, now there is where you're right, where you can say historically. Why is it always to be 100% on the side of the Jews is always to be on the right side of history? Now, why? Is it because the Jews are such a great people? Ultimately, maybe, but that's not why it happens. It happens because the worst forces in history are always against the Jews. And you always know they're the worst forces because they are against what the Jews stand for. So in a way, the one thing you have going for you is a sense that you are representing something immensely important. It couldn't be more important. There is no fight on the campus more important, I assure you, than the fight for the right of the Jewish people to the state of Israel, because all what that represents in the scheme of things, you have to see how huge that is. If it weren't so huge, you wouldn't have had the most cultivated country in Europe, Germany, trying to annihilate the Jews. If the Jews were not so important, you would never have so many forces against them. You wouldn't have all of Stalinism and Marxism, pivoting against the Jews. So you know how important it is to fight for this and to figure out why the others do what they do. That I've written, so much about that and so forth, and could direct you to it. But you see what I mean is that you have to know what you are. You have to understand why these things are happening, where anti-Semitism originates, what its functions are, whom it's serving, how it's working, who is funding, what are the names of the people who are really doing this? Who are they? Where do they come from? I mean, there's a lot of investigative work that has to be done in that, right? It has to be known. But the main thing for the individual and for the groups that are doing this is to just know how important this is, how truly, truly significant.
Now, it's just interesting to me because even if you're a Zionist on campus these days, what you hear sometimes from other Zionists is that it's not that important, right? That you don't want to spend your whole college career getting involved in these arguments, getting involved in these confrontations, because myself and others like me know that it can't, by making your voice heard about what you're passionate about, by what you know is true, by objecting to BDS, by objecting to anti-Zionism on campus, you are potentially subjecting yourselves to personal, social, and even professional loss. There's been commentary in the Jewish world just these past couple weeks about people who lost everything. Their position in certain magazines, their position in certain groups that they were trying to befriend people to get ahead in their career, because during the last operation between Hamas and Israel, they took online to say, I support Israel. And sometimes the most banal, cushiony words possible, not instigating a fight or everyone or anything like that. How is it that we find ourselves in this situation, and what does it say about education of anti-Semitism, Holocaust education? What does it say about efforts that have been done to mitigate this in the past several decades? And have they failed completely? And is it their fault that they failed, and why? And also on the other side of the aisle, the forces that are aggressing, how is it that they have crafted this sort of silver bullet to wreak such havoc?
Well, many answers. The one thing I would, caution us all against is, look, firstly, we're not alone. This is not a Jewish question. We feel it as Jews, but there is an alignment here. It's a conservative alignment. I mean, if you're a member of the Republican Club on a campus, you're not going to find any anti-Jews there. You're just not. There are many groups on campus. If you're going to go to the Catholic Society and, say, let's do something in common, you're not going to find any anti-Israel kids in the Catholic clubs. And in many Asian clubs, I would say at this point, although I don't know them as intimately, I would say there you can find really a lot. Wow, you are taking Harvard to court because you're against affirmative action. Why didn't we do that? Why were we so, still playing the terrified ghetto Jew? Why didn't we undertake that? Although, by the way, many Jews are involved in that court case. So you see, there are many groups on campus. It's not that you don't want to be identified as a Jew Zionist. You don't want to be identified as a conservative on campus. That's where that's who the campus is against, because it is now that progressiveness. Progressive is regressive. You have to, in your mind, understand, you have to flip this. What is progressive really? Progressive is the United States of America. There is no more progressive society. In that sense, the exceptionalism of America is real. Boy, to create America, to read the Federalist Papers, to think of what the Constitution represents, to think of what this country stands for in terms of freedom, in terms of the dignity of the individual. I mean, there's nothing like it, except for us, Israel, of course, represents that too, but this is on a much larger scale, right? So that's progress. Now comes regression to socialism, which has been completely discredited in every country where it's been tried. The regressive socialists say we are progressive. Why? Because they want, to move ahead into really a kind of dictatorship, because it thinks that, of course, it is much better to equalize everybody into nothingness than to allow individuals to flourish and to accept a certain levels of inequity, which is obviously going to be the price of freedom. Freedom, if you're going to have freedom, you're going to have inequalities. Well, you know what? That we'll get. Let's come back to this point of inequalities. But just to stay on point, you see, I would say that you have to understand coalitions. They have a huge coalition of grievance and blame. And that coalition of grievance and blame, through the strangest concatenation of events, has taken the Palestinians as its model. Now, that is so corrupt. I mean, because the Palestinians are the only nationality in the world that are exclusively negative. There is no other group that defines itself that has nothing but negativism to define itself. So you take this group, but you see how strong negativism can be. It's much more powerful to be against than to be for. And that's the strength of anti-Semitism. It's the only ideology that is 100% against. How much easier is that than democracy? Try explaining someone democracy, why it works, but, you know, so many compromises and so on. Anti-Semitism says it's the Jews, it's Israel, it's the occupation, it's them, it's them. Wow, what dynamism, what clarity, what, you know, force. You have to understand how much they have there, but it is regressive and it is oppressive. So, you know, if you understand that real progress in the world has been represented by the United States and by all that it represents and by Judaism, and conserving those values is so important. If they go, it'll take another 1,000 years at least for anything of that kind to develop. The minds that, you see what I mean? So that's what I mean, it's so important. But I would say that outside of that, never think that one is isolated. One is not. They all understand. And by the way, to whom does Ukraine turn? You know who the ideal of Ukraine is. The ideal of Ukraine is Israel. Why? Because Israel shows that a small nation that believes in itself, that nationalism is not a dirty word. It depends what the content of your nationalism is. Nationalism is not Nazism. Nationalism is a very healthy phenomenon when your nation is the United States of America, when your nation stands for something good. So all that the progressives consider to be progress is really regression of the worst and most dangerous kind. There are a lot of people who think like you. Believe me, you know, and there are conservative magazines out there. There are conservative news channels. There are great conservative thinkers, you know, and they're all giving you arguments of all kinds all the time. So, you know, I would say that it's what you're doing is extremely important, you know, doing Zionist work and understanding what Zionism actually stands for, very important. But you have to go out with that a little bit, you know, in other words, learn how to talk about it to others and to see where your alignments are with others. What is it that makes you with other conservative groups? If you can work on that or learn how to do that, that's very important. Much more important than what people actually tend to do, which is stupid. And that is to say, oh, let's get together with a group that's not like us and try to persuade them or something. It is, to me, very debilitating. I don't see, you know, the point of it. If somebody comes to you and says, look, explain it to me, take all the time in the world and do it. But if somebody comes to you and is against you, that's the person you should try to convince. Forget about it. There's a country out there. We have to vote in our people. We have to get across our ideas. So they want you to be on the defensive. but I would say, years ago when we started to talk this, I would say to students always, never defend Israel, never defend. And kids would not understand. What do you mean never defend? Well, because you never fight a war defensively. You always aggress, right? What do you mean you're asking me? Well, who are you? What do you stand for? Who are you supporting? Tear it down. What they stand for is rotten. You see, they are the racists who are playing the race card. And they are the destroyers who say that you're destroying. They turn everything on its head. I mean, they are really a force that is not healthy without going overboard. And if not, so one has to really expose what's wrong. But let me just say that one is not alone. So, oh yeah, okay, so you lose friends, but you cannot imagine how many friends there are out there to be made who are, and if you're where the party is, I mean, if you're having fun and if you're enjoying what you're doing and you look as if you know who you are, that begins to make an impact.
And so Hillel Harkin in your book made a point that that he doesn't see a Jewish future anywhere
in America.
Anywhere but Israel, right? And that the only history that's going to happen is the Jews that live here, and that everyone needs to come here, and this is where our story continues. I'm wondering, and I wonder if you have insights as well, if Aliyah as a method of fulfilling that and a method of rebelling against all this mishigas, is that a better route to take than one where we stay put in Galut and we fight and we make new alliances and we tilt the tables? Or should there be a revitalized movement specifically in North America, perhaps specifically among young people, to learn Hebrew and to get up and go in order to, I guess, have the best line of defense against all of this and to fulfill that Israeliness and that Zionism? I'm wondering.
Well, I would say yes and yes. Yes to both. I'm not that kind of an advice giver. I would never undertake to counsel an individual, but I would say both these things are extremely important. The center of the Jewish world is the land of Israel. And I think that that's clear. I mean, it's just now demographically clear in addition to every other way. And I feel that that is something very important to want, not just to acknowledge, but to see how marvelous that is, that it should be so, right? But the diaspora will never disappear for Jews, because we know that actually the history of the Jewish people began outside the land of Israel, and that we've always believed in coexistence. In other words, coexistence is essential to the Jewish body politic. We are a small people by choice. We are a self-limiting people by choice, which means we will always be among others, whether we are in the land of Israel or whether we are outside the land of Israel. So the problems of both these constituencies are not going to be all that different in many ways. They are going to overlap. Also, you see many Israelis who find the country small, so they want to get out. So where do they come? They come to the biggest place, and they live here among us, more and more of them. They're getting organized now for the first time. They're beginning to want their children to know Hebrew, not to pretend that there's something else. They speak it more openly. This is something new too. Israeliness is becoming part of American life. And if the more one can really call upon them, not to play it down, but to play it up, and to make us Israelis in America too, then it begins to look very different. Then American Jewry really is this Jewry that has its own homeland in Israel, like the Italians, like everyone else. And it just becomes a much more natural thing. We should begin to think of that as being a very natural, existence for us. So I would say, of course, I mean, the center of my consciousness is in the land of Israel. But I feel, that if this is not where I ended up living, I'm not going to, spend my life, in feeling myself a lesser Jew on that account. I do as much as I can from here for both Israel and for the protection of Israel. One thing I would say, though, that this is something else that I've formulated with difficulty, but it seems to me true, that history is going to judge American Jewry by only one thing. Did you or did you not successfully protect the land of Israel? So we have to be ourselves. We have to build culture for ourselves. We have to do that. We have to study, we have to build, we have to build our own institutions. I'm not saying not to do that, to the contrary, but you have to understand that in the scheme of Jewish history, if you see it, through the ages, American Jewry as Jewry is going to be judged only by this one thing. In the same way that in the 30s, American Jewry had really one task above all others: to be there for the Jewry of Europe. What could one do? How could one make this country take its responsibility for that? Well, this is even bigger, because Israel is aligned with the United States in its values, in its deepest values and culture. So the more we stand for Israel in that respect, the more we're standing for the United States of America. Not only is there not, dual loyalty, it's doubled loyalty. It's always a doubled loyalty, right? That the more you stand for Israel, the more you stand for the United States of America, and vice versa, right?
Agree more.
Right.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so now, thank you, Professor Wisse. I had so many more questions, but I'm so glad that it was.
Yeah, we don't have much more time.
Not much more time, but we're going to go on to audience questions now, if that's all right with you. So the first one is one that I love. It's actually from a friend of mine who couldn't be here, but I helped her write this question. She says, "One of the most refreshing things about your life and about your career is the emphasis on Yiddish. I think it's taken for granted these days that Yiddish is political. There has been a sort of renaissance in the last several years of young left-wing anti-Zionist Jews reigniting a passion for Yiddish as a rebellion against Zionism and against Israel, nodding to its socialist and communist and anti-Zionist roots. But some Zionists, like myself, have a sincere connection with Yiddish because many of our grandparents spoke it. What would you say the conflict is? Would you say the conflict between Yiddish and Zionism are destined to remain apart?"
The destiny part of it, it's so well formulated, that question, that it has in itself the whole explanation. I can't foretell how that works. It has to do with the woman who wrote that question, basically. If she is a strong Zionist who understands how important Yiddish was to Zionism and how important, Zionism is to Yiddish, again, I mean, it's a complete perversion to have claimed Yiddish as the language of socialism. Now, I can't go into here why that happened and how it happened, but let me make this point, that you see, my great teacher was Max Weinreich. He was just an extraordinary person. And if you read his volume, The History of the Yiddish Language, I know it looks monstrously academic, but for those who can crack it and read it, it is such a brilliant and interesting book. Well, the case that he makes in this book, he calls Yiddish the language of Derech Hashas, the language of the Talmud. He calls Yiddish the language of the way of the Talmud. What does he mean by that? He wanted to show that Yiddish was the repository of Jewishness. And he shows it in so many ways, that the Yiddish language became the repository of Jewishness. You see it in the language, you see it in the sayings, you see it in this. So he felt, and this is a marvelous thing, no? But here's the difficulty. He thought it could work in reverse. He thought that because Yiddish was the repository of Yiddish, therefore Yiddish could provide Jewishness. That Jewishness could grow out of Yiddish the way Yiddish grew out of Jewishness. Shall I tell you that his son became a priest? And this is not, his son is a marvelous man. He speaks a perfect Yiddish. A beautiful Yiddish that you can really see, but you know, but here's it's really very, he's so instructive, because he wrote a book about himself, and he wrote this. He said, people asked me why I converted to Christianity. He said, I didn't convert to Christianity. I converted to religion. The Yiddish that he had was so rich. Mm-hmm. It had no spiritual content. It had nothing that he needed. So when he married a woman who was deeply religious, and she did have a church, and she did have, he was so attracted to that. Now, I use this as an extreme example with all my love, right? I don't say this to you with anything but love for both these people, the teacher, but it's the truth. Yiddish itself is the repository of Jewishness that went into it, but Yiddish is not the content of Jewishness. Mm-hmm. And certainly it's not, socialist Yiddish is even less the content of Jewishness. Mm-hmm. So it's a very, very, I understand, you know, more, we could talk about how this happened, why this happened, but basically that's the conclusion one would come to, is what I've tried to articulate here.
Yeah, it's a story that a lot of more people need to hear. Okay, so our last and a half question is, I'm going to do 2 in 1, just so that we make the most of our time. So this first one is, how can we engage in healthy peace dialogue between both Israelis and Palestinians? And the second one is, which is sort of, I feel like you're going to find a way to appropriately tether them together. The second one is it not problematic to claim that only one political party is the home of pro-Jewish, pro-Israel identification? Is there really no home for pro-Israel, pro-Jewish Jews on the left?
Well, I mean, look, the people who write these questions and who ask these questions are the ones who can provide the answers. You see, it's as if you ask me this question, and because you want to make me responsible for the answer, right? You want me to be responsible for the fact that the Democratic Party now houses a great many anti-Israel forces within itself. I'm not responsible for that. I wish it weren't so. I mean, I wish, you know, if the Republican Party had in it people like the Squad, if it were the party that really was out there, you know, instead of doing the Abraham Accords, you know, which the Republican Party, now do I want it to be the Republican Party that stands for that? I wouldn't care if it were the Democratic Party that stood for that. You know, if Obama had come into office and he had tried to really bring, you know, the American embassy to Jerusalem, if he had gone out there and said, listen to the Arabs, it's time that you came and that we all came together because basically you have so many common interests, let's form the Abraham Accords, I would have been thrilled. Would I have said that, I'm against him because, because he's a Democrat? Nonsense. So the question is turned upside down. You see, you have to see who holds what opinions and why they hold them. Now you can, if you can change that in some way, if you live in a district where you can get a Democrat representing you who really represents your values and who will fight for them within the party, and you feel that's something that you can do, well, that may be a wonderful thing, but that's not how politics works. That's not how the political system of the United States was meant to work, you see. Nobody else does it that way. Jews can't act differently from everyone else. Hispanics now are turning to the Republican Party in greater numbers. Why? Because they say, wait a minute, where do our real interests lie? I'm really for charter schools for my kid. Where am I going to find them? I'm really for the family. Who stands for the family? I'm speaking now as a Hispanic, right? I'm really deeply conservative Christian. Who represents my values? They go down the line and they look around and they say, wait a minute, it's that party. So they join that party. That's what healthy people do. Now, Jews who have defined their Jewishness as being members of the Democratic Party can't do it that way. The Democratic Party has become their Jewishness. And so they hold you responsible because they think that you blame the Democratic Party for being anti-Jew. It's not that way at all. I'm not blaming them. I'm just a realist. That happens to be the party that is attracting positions which are on all counts, almost all counts, not mine. You see, these are not my primary values. I have to follow my primary values. I've changed my political party within my lifetime. It's not the easiest thing that you do, to start voting for a party that you never voted for before. Nobody finds that easy. But when I saw that the alignments had changed, and in the book I describe it, nobody, it was over Poland in my case. It was not over Israel, right? But I realized that the party that, for me, the Polish fight against communism at that time, Poland was the fighting front line against communism. And for me, that was the most important fight of its time. So, of course, the party that stood for that is the party I would vote for. So I would turn the question around to the people who ask that with such fun. Don't you think that both parties, well, okay, prove it. I mean, you have to face the truth. If you, and what is, we never get a party, we never get a representative who represents us completely. We never have a president who represents us completely. It's a democracy. We know how difficult that is. We're always juggling. But you have to understand what is the primary thing that you are voting for. And in my case, really, I confess that the most important thing to me is where do you stand on Israel? Because to me, the alignment begins there. I can see that it may not stand up for everything. There's a point here where, hey, I don't like that point. For example, I think that Trump is a terrible leader of the party, terrible. And I'm hoping against hope that he will not be the representative of the Republican Party next time around. I can't tell you how great my hope is for that and so forth. So that's a consideration, right? It's a huge consideration. But it's one consideration, and there are others. And if your primary consideration is what, and if you know what that is, you have to think deeply about why you're not willing to say that to yourself, why you're not willing to accept reality, and not to blame others for not to blame others, for seeing what you refuse to see.
Mm-hmm. And just tethering it back to Israel. So the first part of that question, this I actually might have to do with the various attempts under both Democrats and Republicans to try to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, trying to solve the Arab war against Israel.
Yes.
Is there a way forward? What needs to change in our approach right now? Is it worth getting two sides to come to the table, as the original question pointed out?
No, it's worth doing everything to get them to change. It's worth thinking through everything to get them to change. They have to change. We don't have to change. I see no point in making nice unless they are going to change. The war is a totally unilateral war since 1948, or since the beginning of time. Totally unilateral. It's not. Jews do not want to destroy the Arab world, and they do not want to take Damascus, and they do not want to take more land than is rightly the land of Israel. And what difference does it make to the Arab world that has 640 times more land than Israel has anyway? Is land the problem for the Arabs? Is Jordan not Palestine? I don't understand it. I mean, so Jews want to invent a reason to blame themselves because they think that if they blame themselves, they can solve the problem. If I'm the problem, all I have to do is change, and that will solve the problem. Well, hello. You can't solve the problem by changing. If they don't change, you haven't solved the problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. I think that was a perfect way to wrap things up.
Thank you. Thanks for this chance.
Of course, that last minute answer was something that is a very much indoctrinated. It's cooked into NZC as an organization. We constantly are telling that to young people, constantly telling that to students, that you as a Zionist young person, you as a Jewish young person, all you need is that moral clarity, that self-confidence. You don't need to change anything about yourself, because it is, at the end of the day, on campus, an organization of politics against the Jews, a unilateral war against us and our interests, whether in the academic realm, professional realm, artistic, like what have you. We've seen this kind of energy everywhere. So sorry that I couldn't get to every question, but thank you so much, Professor Wisse.
Very grateful to everybody. Thank you so much. Okay.
Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and make sure yes, bye-bye. Make sure to follow us online on social media, everyone who's attending right now. But thank you again, Professor Wisse.
Sure. Bye-bye.